You are looking at the structural logs of the United States macroeconomic safeguard architecture. The timestamp is February 27, 2026.
Right. And before we initiate the sequence, we need to state the operational parameters of this session.
Acknowledged. The source files before us contain highly polarized, politically volatile actions regarding the current U.S. administration. As analysts, we take no sides. We endorse no viewpoints.
We are here strictly to process the data, map the mechanics of the system, and report on the structural integrity of the architecture.
Exactly. Our objective for this deep dive, this system autopsy, is to examine the pressure points. We're looking at mechanisms, not events. We're analyzing failure, not chaos.
To understand the current readings, you have to understand the baseline architecture. The system you are examining was engineered with very specific assumptions. Primarily a hard firewall between fiscal policy and monetary policy.
Right. In a normal, healthy operation, the legislative branch controls taxation and spending. The Federal Reserve acts as an independent central bank.
Controlling the money supply and managing inflation.
Yes. And regulatory agencies act as diagnostic sensors to monitor systemic financial risks, while trade tariffs are intended to be targeted mechanisms authorized directly by Congress.
That is the blueprint. But the data we are reviewing today shows a severe deviation from that baseline. We are going to analyze how this architecture was systematically dismantled.
We will trace the progression from the blueprints to the incentives, the resulting behavior, the structural failure, and the consequences. Let's look at the primary signals.
Pull up the logs. The earliest critical signal in this specific sequence originates from legislative action. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
The OBBA. This was the 2025 Reconciliation Act. Break down the mechanics of that specific bypass for the record.
In normal operation, a standard bill requires 60 votes to clear the Senate. A Reconciliation Act is a legislative bypass. It allows a budget-related bill to pass with a simple majority of 51.
It was originally designed for expedited fiscal adjustments.
Correct. But when a system utilizes a bypass mechanism to push through massive structural changes without broad consensus, it places extreme stress on the overall architecture.
Look at the exact weight of this fiscal failure. The OBBA injected it's a $4.7 trillion deficit increase into the system for the period of 2026 through 2035.
Isolate the immediate data for 2026. What does the telemetry show right now?
For 2026, the deficit sits at $1.9 trillion. That represents 5.8% of the nation's gross domestic product.
For context, the historical average over the last 50 years is 3.8%. Furthermore, total federal spending has reached 23.3% of GDP.
If you run the Congressional Budget Office models on this trajectory, it forces the national debt to 120% of GDP by 2036.
It is a mathematical certainty that debt at this scale alters the gravitational pull of the entire economy. But the logs show an opposing force applied simultaneously.
Right. At the same time this massive deficit expansion was executed at the top, compensatory cuts were made to social infrastructure. They actively removed liquidity from the base of the economy.
The CBO and Brookings Institution models indicate that Medicaid cuts. These included strict 80-hour monthly work requirement strip coverage from 5 million people in 2026 alone.
And currently, cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program removed 2 million people from the Food Assistance Registry.
From a strictly mechanical standpoint, this is a simultaneous depletion of consumer demand capability. You are superheating the top of the engine with debt,
while starving the base of fuel.
Precisely. And this friction points directly to a critical system shock recorded on February 20th, 2026.
Let's examine the timeline of what we classify as the tariff anomaly.
On that morning, the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 decision, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts. The ruling struck down the executive branch's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
The IEEPA. They were using it to impose global tariffs.
Yes. And the court's logic was structurally rigid. Utilizing emergency powers to unilaterally rewrite the tariff code is illegal. The Constitution grants Congress the exclusive power of taxation.
The market telemetry captured the immediate reaction. The U.S. dollar index dropped 0.4% instantly. Customs and Border Protection had to physically sever all IEEPA-related tariff codes from their internal systems at midnight.
The mechanical consequence of this legal reversal is severe. The federal government is now legally liable for $160 to $175 billion in illegally collected duties.
Those funds must be compensated back to American importers. It is a massive unfunded liability suddenly dropped onto the ledger.
However, the structural logs show an immediate override of that failure. Hours after the Supreme Court verdict, the executive branch activated Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act.
Explain the parameters of Section 122.
It is a provision that permits temporary import surcharges, specifically to combat balance of payments deficits. Using this legal instrument, a new 10% global tariff was implemented.
Which was impulsively raised to 15% by the following day.
Exactly. The legal justification changed, but the pressure on the global supply chain remained constant. They swapped out a break-in valve for a temporary patch to maintain the exact same flow.
So the data shows us a massive fiscal hole and an aggressive tariff regime. But a failure of this magnitude does not just happen in a vacuum. Let's trace the incentives.
We need to analyze who actually absorbs the cost of this architecture and who remains insulated from it. Pull up the report published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Timestamp is February 12, 2026.
The New York Fed conducted a forensic analysis on the flow of the tariff burden. They relied on hard data from the Census Bureau and the International Trade Commission.
And the economists proved that 90 to 94% of the economic burden was passed directly to U.S. firms and U.S. consumers.
It was not absorbed by foreign exporters. Yale's budget lab corroborates this, estimating the cost at $1,400 per American household.
The St. Louis Fed also noted these tariffs directly caused 10.9% of all personal consumption expenditures inflation. The data is empirical and conclusive. The base bears the cost.
When empirical data contradicts a preferred operational narrative, institutional systems often exhibit retaliatory behavior. We observe a deliberate blackout tactic deployed here.
The objective is to suppress the diagnostic sensors of the economic engine. Look at February 18, 2026. Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, appeared on CNBC.
He categorized the New York Fed report as a disgrace.
More importantly, he publicly threatened disciplinary action against the government economists responsible for the research.
Attempting to blind the system's own analysts is a severe structural failure. You are essentially turning off the fire alarms because you do not like the noise.
But the logs show an escalation from rhetoric to a hard legal mechanism. We identify this as the Subpoena Anomaly. By mid-January 2026, the Department of Justice issued grand jury subpoenas targeting Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell.
The stated pretext for this investigation is an inquiry into the cost of the Federal Reserve headquarters renovation. They are investigating whether Powell misled Congress regarding those expenses.
Let's strip away the pretext. What is the actual structural friction occurring here?
Forensic analysis of the financial markers indicates this is a mechanism mathematically designed to force Powell's removal. The underlying friction is the Fed's refusal to slash interest rates in a highly inflationary environment.
By deploying federal law enforcement to apply pressure on the independent central bank, the system crosses a critical threshold into fiscal dominance.
The executive branch is attempting to criminalize monetary policy.
And the bond market reacted immediately to this threat. Look at the telemetry from January into February. The 10-year Treasury yield, which is the primary gauge of global institutional trust in the United States, became highly volatile.
It dropped from 4.21% down to 4.02%.
Simultaneously, the yield curve inverted. Unpack that mechanism for the record. Why is an inverted yield curve relevant?
An inverted yield curve is a mathematical siren. In a healthy economic engine, investors demand a higher premium, a higher interest rate for tying up their capital for 10 years compared to 2 years.
Because there is simply more unknown risk over a decade.
Right. When the curve inverts, it means short-term yields are paying more than long-term yields. The market is pricing in immediate, severe instability.
They are signaling that the engine is about to stall, and they want to be compensated for the short-term crash.
This leads us directly into how the system's architecture permitted regulatory capture by shadow capital. Let's examine the convergence of crypto assets and oligarchic influence.
The primary focal point in the data is the Tether vulnerability. Tether is a stablecoin. It operates with a market capitalization exceeding $186 billion.
But the architectural flaw is glaring. Tether has never undergone a full standard audit by an authoritative, independent accounting firm. It relies purely on its own corporate attestations.
And the incentive conflict surrounding this vulnerability maps directly to the highest levels of the current administration. Consider the confirmation of Howard Lutnick as the Secretary of Commerce on February 18, 2026.
Lutnick is the CEO of the investment bank Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald manages the vast majority of Tether's reserves.
They claim to hold $122.3 billion in U.S. Treasuries and $19.3 billion in repurchase agreements on Tether's behalf.
Clarify the mechanics of a repurchase agreement.
A repurchase agreement, or repo, is essentially a short-term collateralized loan. One party sells securities to another with a strict agreement to buy them back later at a higher price.
It is a way to generate fast, short-term liquidity. It is a standard financial plumbing tool, but it requires absolute trust in the underlying collateral.
Despite this deep, multi-billion-dollar financial integration, Lutnick categorically refused to recuse himself from the president's working group on digital asset markets,
Which is the specific body responsible for drafting stablecoin regulations.
The system is now engineered so that the individual responsible for overseeing digital asset regulation is financially dependent on the exact entity being regulated.
That is not a bypass of the guardrails, that is the complete removal of them.
This convergence accelerates when you look at the executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a U.S. digital asset stockpile.
The order centralizes government-seized cryptocurrency and mandates the purchase of new Bitcoin using federal funds.
But trace the personal financial disclosures analyzed by ethics watchdogs. 19 highly placed White House officials personally own between $875,000 and $2.35 million in the exact crypto assets proposed for this national reserve.
The capitalization of public policy for private gain is a classic terminal indicator of institutional failure. When the architects of a system position themselves to profit from its structural changes, the integrity of the output is compromised.
We see this exact mechanic replicated in the immigration and revenue architecture. We classify this as the golden card failure. Executive Order 14351 bypassed congressional authority entirely to replace the EB-5 visa program.
Establish the baseline. How did the EB-5 program operate before the bypass?
The traditional EB-5 required foreign nationals to make direct investments into real physical businesses, commercial enterprises that generated at least 10 verified American jobs. It was tied to tangible economic output.
The newly engineered gold card operates on a completely different mechanical premise. It is a straight, unattached donation to the U.S. Treasury.
The parameters are explicitly transactional. $1 million purchases a standard gold card. $2 million purchases a corporate gold card, which can actually be transferred between employees for an additional fee.
But the true structural anomaly lies in the highest tier. We isolate this as the platinum anomaly. Break down the parameters of the $5 million tier.
For a $5 million payment, foreign nationals receive immediate U.S. residency and complete immunity from U.S. taxes on all foreign income.
That is not an immigration policy. That is a mechanism mathematically designed for global capital laundering.
Correct. It essentially converts the United States into a premium onshore tax haven. Our records show this initiative did not materialize from a vacuum.
It was heavily lobbied for by real estate interests, who injected $2.1 million into the lobbying effort, functioning alongside major venture capital firms.
By implementing this via executive order, it directly violates the Immigration and Nationality Act. That guarantees eventual legal paralysis in the courts.
But in the interim, the mechanism functions exactly as intended. It imports massive amounts of unverified liquidity.
We have mapped the fiscal failures, the suppressed diagnostics, and the regulatory capture. But to understand the current fragility of this system, you must look at the administrative capacity to respond to a crisis.
What happens when multiple failures converge?
Look at the data regarding the administrative purge executed under the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Executive Order 14222 dismantled civil service protections and instituted a strict 1-to-4 hiring rule.
The result was the termination of 290,000 federal workers.
The metadata reveals a critical fracture in this specific initiative. Elon Musk, originally tapped to lead DOGE, abruptly exited the role in early 2026.
His stated reason is documented in the logs. He concluded that the massive deficit expansion created by the OBBA completely undermined their efficiency mandate. The math simply did not reconcile.
More importantly, the purge stripped the government of specialized personnel. It hollowed out complex regulatory agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
It leaves the system effectively blind and paralyzed when a shock occurs.
As analysts examining a system autopsy, we must isolate the variables that currently lack resolution. We classify these as open loops.
Open loop 1. We do not know if the Section 122 tariffs will survive past their 150-day legal limit.
The statute requires congressional approval to extend beyond that tight window. Current market pricing cannot accurately model the probability of that approval, creating a suspended state of volatility.
Open loop 2. We do not know the true liquidity of Tether's $186 billion reserves.
If a bank run occurs on Tether, if holders suddenly demand fiat currency en masse, the exposure cascades directly to Cantor Fitzgerald.
And from Cantor, that systemic shock transfers directly into the U.S. Treasury market. The firewall that should exist between highly volatile offshore digital assets and sovereign U.S. debt has been deliberately removed by the individuals currently managing the system.
And these open loops are intersecting with a mathematically inevitable event clearly recorded in the financial logs. We classify this as the doom loop of the commercial real estate market.
The underlying data is severe and unavoidable. Between 2024 and 2026, an estimated $700 billion to $1 trillion in commercial real estate loans are scheduled to default.
The mechanics of this failure are straightforward. Office buildings and retail centers were financed during an era of 0% interest rates. Those loans are maturing now.
The owners face refinancing at current, highly elevated treasury yields. Simultaneously, the core valuations of those physical properties have plummeted due to permanent shifts in remote work patterns.
The math is upside down. So the mechanical outcome is that property owners are simply choosing to default. They are walking away and handing the keys back to the lenders.
But who holds that debt? The primary shock absorbers for this impact are not the major diversified Wall Street institutions.
The debt is concentrated in American regional banks. They hold the vast majority of these commercial real estate loans.
When regional banks are forced to absorb hundreds of billions in losses, their liquidity simply evaporates. To survive, they must constrict.
They cease lending to small and medium businesses in their local footprints. The economic lifeblood of the base is cut off.
In a fully functional architecture, the regulatory and administrative state agencies equipped with diagnostic tools and intervention mechanisms would step in to manage this contagion.
But as we established, the administrative purge eliminated the specialized personnel required to engineer a soft landing.
The institutional capacity to stop this doom loop no longer exists. They fired the mechanics right before the engine seized.
We have completed the mapping of the available data. Moving to the final synthesis of the logs, look at the entirety of the board. What you are looking at is not a sequence of coincidental, unrelated crises.
It is a systematic mathematical failure of safeguards.
The foundational architecture of the United States economy, the strict separation of powers, the mechanisms for fiscal restraint, independent financial regulation, and empirically driven monetary policy has been methodically overwritten.
It has been replaced by a system characterized entirely by fiscal dominance and corporate integration.
The guardrails were not circumvented by accident. The data shows they were deliberately dismantled. We observe a system functioning exactly as its new parameters dictate.
The costs are uniformly distributed to the consumer base via aggressive tariffs and structural inflation.
Meanwhile, the benefits, the liquidity, and the legal immunities are heavily concentrated within a highly insulated administrative and oligarchic network.
When the specific individuals mandated to prevent a systemic financial collapse are the primary beneficiaries of its architecture, and the alarm systems have been deliberately disconnected, who is left to hit the brakes?